Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Je suis la présidente de la Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine et à ce titre, je suis ravie.
Good morning. We're very happy to welcome you and to welcome this symposium or colloquium, which is the result of partnerships with several institutions. I'm happy to say hello to Oscar Berg, the head of the Arena Association, Éric Daniel Lacombe, director of the chair Nouvelles Urbanités face aux risques naturels from ENSA Paris-La Villette, Xavier Bonneau, head of the Gerfaut laboratory, ENSA La Villette, and Chris Younes, who's the head of the scientific board of the Scientifique et Technique Network, Philo. And we're used to having her. So La Cité, la Maison de l'Architecture, is where we are. And therefore, we want to also welcome researchers, students, academics, but also all the disciplines which today are connected to architecture in general, and how we can live in this world, which is a question that has gained more meaning. It's the fourth colloquium that we've been organizing since 2015. Again, architecture, again, philosophy in 2015, synergetic design in 2017, archaic and possibilities in 2018. And these are the conferences that we've organized before, asking many questions to each other. And these topics are even more important today, given the topic that we're going to delve into. And we gather together architects and philosophers, or architecture and philosophy, to be more specific. Why should we challenge these topics and questions, ask questions to each other on that topic? Well, that's obvious. It's for the world. The world is feeling there's a sense of urgency, something that we must do, that we must act. But also because this is really what these two disciplines do. Architecture has an objective, which is they want human beings to live in the world that surrounds us, and philosophy, whose final objective is to ask questions. I think I remember a philosophy teacher a long time ago who said, you've started asking yourselves questions, you'll never stop. And that's true. That is very much the case. So philosophy is going to help us ask questions, but also is going to give us keys to decipher a number of things. And so we'll open this colloquium entitled Dealing with Risks. It's obvious for us. That's the reason why we've chosen this theme. And we're proud of having chosen this theme, because these two topics and more will be at the very crux of what we're going to be talking. La Cité is doing a number of things on these themes. As you probably know, this is the venue where the Global Awards of Sustainable Architecture is organized and has been organized for a long while. And I hope that in the future we'll be able to give more visibility to La Cité and what we do in this area. And finally, in passing, I wanted to say that in parallel, we've just opened an exhibition called Aerodreams, that is on architecture and design that's inflatable. I know it's a bit of a utopia that, however, we could look at with a critical eye, but then it's utopia connected to the very first green movement, a generation of green movements, which continues today and lingers with Sarah Cheno, who's going to be here soon for a debate on the 27th of October. You're most welcome to the exhibition and to the debate. Without further ado, I'll hand over to the most important people for this colloquium, and I hope that you enjoy these 2 days that you're going to spend with us.
Bonjour à tous et bonjour à toutes.
Good morning, one and all. I wanted to say thank you because we have 250 people who said they would register, but I think we don't have that many people in the room. So we're going to start with you because you arrived on time, and that's a very good thing. Now, we thought we could organize this in February, but then we said we're not going to have such a meeting online. We thought we'll wait for the health crisis to be over so that we can meet again, so that we can have an in-person colloquium. And also perhaps because the theme itself, that is risks and the sharing of risks, is a moment that has to be in the form of an in-person meeting. And I think we did the right thing, given the number of people who registered, to organize an in-meeting. The colloquium. Thank you, Catherine Chevillot, President of the Cité de l'Architecture, to welcome us in this auditorium that we always enjoy. Thank you, Marie-Hélène Contab, Director of Cultural Development for the Cité de l'Architecture, for the trust you place in us and your support as well. Year in, year out, when we discuss architecture and philosophy. I'd also like to thank the many speakers who've reshuffled their presentations, and thank you for being available during the pre-meetings that we organized together. And I'd like to thank the members from the organization committee, Eric Daniela Combe and Chris Younes, for sharing their scientific views during this adventure. I'd like to say thank you to Benjamin Breton, Nicolas Goubier, who work at the Faire, Nouvelles Urbanités, Risques Naturels and Gerfo. They are on the exhibition at present, placing posters, but I'd like to thank them for organizing this. It is incredible. And that's the reason why we can have these 2 days now. They've worked on all of the details, ins and outs. As you've said before, let me come back to the previous events that we organized, because this is, if you will, like an adventure. It's our 4th meeting, Architecture and Philosophy, a meeting that we have at the Cité de l'Architecture. In 2015, we had started the cycle with encore l'architecture, encore la philosophie. Architecture again and philosophy again. So that 40 years down the road, we would meet again between philosophy and architecture, which started in the 1980s on the notion of deconstruction. But we thought we'd not finished this conversation, so we thought we would need to reinitiate it. And then in 2016, after gaining experience, au tournant de l'expérience, we questioned the built environment, and we looked at phenomenology and pragmatism to focus on experience, which is very important in architecture for the designers, but also for the general public. And then in 2018, with L'archaïque et c'est possible, we looked at re-emergence and the initial gestures that appeared here and there everywhere in the architectural movements, which according to us was bearing new meaning. Today, our colloquium, dealing with risks, is connected to personal experiences and situations that people were faced with during the COVID pandemic, because all of these recent events show the potential of destroying the natural habitat and how vulnerable the many inhabited environments are. And each and every one of us have gone through a number of ordeals, yet we do hope that we'll remember Odd Hölderlin, who said, where danger appears what can save you as well. So individually and collectively, and in the light of these risks, we will have to find ways of inventing and transforming that will be sharing amongst each other. Therefore, what we're going to do is appraise the natural and cultural dynamics that are complex and worrisome to some extent, that destructure the very living that exists on the planet. The objective is to promote a possibility of a renewal for a culture of architectural and urban installations. How can we move towards something else? What can we learn from facing these difficulties in very risky environments? So this is a meeting point between different disciplines. The 4 half days of this symposium will be looking at intelligibility of philosophy, and also the possibility of having a tangible architecture on the basis of 4 themes. We'll be building on shared vulnerabilities so as to give totally importance to the notion of vulnerability and the care philosophy, so that we would not just look at a struggle of powers The second theme is to listen to other narratives of installation, because we'll have to debunk habits of the existing urban fabric of the profession and modus operandi that no longer meet the changes. Number three, we'll document the collapses and prepare the refoundations, probably because by nature architecture is a positive thing, regardless of the situation, regardless of the level considered and the tools available. And then we'll imagine and share new architectural figures between shelters and openings. These new adventures, the new aesthetics, seem to be connected to this context on which hover uncertainties. Therefore, during these 2 days, and knowing that there are more risks threatening us in territories here and there, we will have to specify the possible actions that we can consider from architecture, and we'll have to identify the social and cultural opportunities that emerge. This is what we're going to do, and these are the links between architecture and philosophy, a displacement of the imaginary and of the know-how, so that we can continue and live and build whilst knowing all of the possible risks and the potential of destruction. Well, this colloquium will also be a co-development with the chaire de recherche, the research chair on open shelters, l'architecture comme clinique préalable pour les futurs abris ouverts, and they have started a very interesting program. Dear Eric, you will introduce this chair and the partnership that we've started or entered into for this colloquium. Hello, I'm Eric Daniel Lacombe. Thank you, Madam President. We know that there are risks, so what are the questions attached? I have a question for architects, philosophers and geographers, but also one for those who live there, the dwellers. What are the questions for the dwellers? If you look at the picture that's just behind me, there's water that's reached already 1 meter in height. So it's in the town of Romorantin. It's something that had not been seen for 100 years. So we've practiced with inhabitants so that they can they know how to react. So they're very calm, as you can see, but this is normal. This is very slow. And as you can see, we have 3 people there, and they're asking themselves a question. They're saying, okay, the water's here already. The architects had told us that this might happen at 50 centimeters and then 1 meter. And then, as you can see, they have reached the highest level, 1 meter. They don't know if it's going to go higher or not. They're not panicking, but then the water rose to 1.45 meters. Lord Torjanski, I'd like to thank you. You represent the French government, and together with your department and service, you had set a maximum that was 1.5 meters. That's the type of question that architects ask, and that's good for the inhabitants to be able to ask themselves the question so that they're not going to die, but also so that we don't damage the built environment. And the question I was asking to myself, the question I'm asking within the chair, is that I have the impression that in the past 2,000 years, architecture is a construct of the mind whereby people can forget about the constraints attached to nature. And this is always what people ask us to do when there's a disaster. They say, you should build something that's more solid, that's more tight, etc., as if we didn't have enough skills. It's like music. Architecture doesn't derive its models from nature. We invent something that's above nature. And even architectural schools could be involved in that thinking. And thus, this is what we understand in the chair, is that the contemporary dwellers and city dwellers are cut from nature. And of course, they're not very happy to see that much water, but the way they relate to water now is something that's going to be in their lives forever. And we're faced with an ecological challenge, which is such that we must radically change things in the decades to come. The links between nature and human beings. We used to use nature, and now we have to care for nature and protect non-human living lives, and also do this within the framework of natural regulation. I don't know if we can do this with La Roya, because in this case, when there's a flood, it's rocks that fall, not just water. That's what we call solid movements. That's another risk. And the starting point for us, either with the architects or when we teach or in our chair, which is in between the office, the labs and school, is that rather than isolating architecture, architecture should help people cohabitate in terms of the uses we make of the built environment and could live emotionally with the living world. If we think that a disaster is an ordeal, we'll never have these friendly links with nature. This, I think, is the question that we would need to ask ourselves during these 2 days to come. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for welcoming us. Thank you for this colloquium that's dear to our hearts. I won't be long, but I'd like perhaps to say something. Oh, I've got to do this quickly. Well, these links between architecture and philosophy is something that we thought that Derrida thought about as a thinking meeting point. I read a lot on the links between architecture and philosophy, and in all of these texts, there's a lot that's been written, a lot that's been said, a long discourse, but when Derrida said it's a meeting point that forces us to think, I thought that this was truly what I was seeing in schools of architecture when architecture and philosophy work hand in hand. And I think that if Derrida was with us, and this is what we all hope, well, we could perhaps agree on something, or at least we could come up with some type of controversy, or because I think we've arrived at a new moment in this meeting point where we are urged to think. It's a long tradition, but then there's a turnaround because we have to think about the conditions that are necessary for experiments, which was, I think, something very important, which started, I'd say, in the 70s. And the question is the meeting point between architecture and philosophy that was based on the conditions necessary for experiments. Experiments that were smart and also that was sensitive. So it's the world of what's rational to a world that's rational, that meets sensitivities. But today the question perhaps is a different type of question, as we've just heard. And this is what we'll be discussing during these 2 days, is to rethink the conditions of our existence and coexistence in a philosophical way. Even though we could think about the conditions of thinking through the filter of space and time. This was a philosophy dating back to the 18th century that was very much marked by what was possible, that is, access to some type of truth through space and time, the screen of space and time. This was a philosophical question in the 18th century, and this is when they were meeting the architects. That is a meeting point between space and time, and perhaps also what's non-time and non-space. Today, we've come to this threshold. What's important is the conditions for existence and life. I know it sounds very easy, but it's far from having been conceptualized, and it is yet a bit unclear today. It is a bit fuzzy, and Donna Haraway was mentioning that as well, to live with something that's perhaps a bit fuzzy, so this notion lingers. And this turnaround is something we've never seen before, when architecture and philosophy meet at a certain moment, either voluntarily or not, and when they meet a number of concerns that destabilize human beings, that are also very much popular. Everybody is asking themselves the question, and mainly the younger generations. They're asking the question again. And the possibility of living is something they experience, and also the possibility of living for all, not just saving the happy few and then giving up on the rest. It's a major issue. We've seen this in games, in cereals, and that is, there's an excessive consumption, or as Michel Serres would have said, we are taking more from the earth than we're giving the earth, and this is what's at stake. And if you look at the numbers, it's easy to understand. Consumption's too high. We use up too many resources. We all know that on Earth. If you look at statistics, we can measure this. So we need 1.6 planets to live. But it's only for some, not for everybody. These are very important for architects and philosophers. So we will need to come to this meeting point. And also, given the text that we've received beforehand, and given the discussions that have already started, I'd say that everybody, I think, would agree to say that architecture is not here to install objects or artifacts. Architecture is not here to install artifacts in stable and inert spaces. And this is more or less what we got from the past. There was a modernist thinking that was saying that space was inert and you could place and install things in this space. No, we are in environments that are ever-changing and that are also co-evolving. So there's this future that's driving us. We're not necessarily just repeating the same again and again. So we are at a loss. We are in a fuzzy area, as Donau says. We are a bit lost. We don't know where we are. We have to go back to the earth, the soil, and this means that all of our certainties are shaken, and philosophy, in a way, was a streak of certainties. If you read Plato or Aristotle or Descartes, I think so I am, and all these certainties, La Discours de la Méthode is about certainties. And now, these certainties are very much shaken. How can we redeploy a new type of horizon? How can we inject new possibilities in our future? This is an essential question. It's a critical question as well, because we've arrived at this critical turning point, I think. And finally, if we don't install objects, we'll install places. The question of places is very important. Places located in a vast space where the plural is the most important aspect. But if you look at history, its architectures and philosophy have always helped us consider the notion of sharing, political sharing, an ethical and aesthetic sharing. These are the most important sharings when you look at all human installations and when you look at all inhabited places. So these places are plural, they're located, they're sensitive, they're emotional, and as Eric was saying earlier on, all of these questions lead us to questioning intelligence and emotions as well. All that's done on our brains and research on the brain really demonstrate that this is true. We know what really is at stake. What's at stake is to challenge and question dualities. That's a fact. Today, these dualities are being questioned. Either the duality between nature and culture, des scholars mentioning this. These are perhaps major references, and Nietzsche also was talking about going beyond good and evil, beyond this turnaround point, which is a turnaround point where the question would be that of the separation between humans and non-humans. You see, it's always these linkages and the questions that people have in themselves, and also the cross-cutting questions, our own questionings. That is, how can we do things with? How can we rethink our boundaries or limits? How can we do things together? are we able of thinking of symbiosis or synergies? This is what we'll be working on. Thank you very much for your attention.
And when we had organized this symposium in February with Jean-Pierre, he thought he would be in France, and so he put off this colloquium to this autumn, and he said that he would be in the United States for his teaching semester. So it's from Stanford that he sent us his contribution that we'll be looking at together. Jean-Pierre Dupuis drafted in 2002 a very important book for an enlightened catastrophism. And this book, with the book of the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, La Société du Risque, which was published in 2001. Here we're talking about the degradation dynamism and the risk that we discover a little bit more every day, which is intertwined in the industrial civilizations and here beyond their power of installation. So the book on catastrophisme éclairé, here we're not surprised by these disasters, but we are looking at the mechanism of these disasters. The crisis, because the catastrophe is a hateful fate, and we don't want it, and we have to keep staring at them, keep our eyes fixed on them, and never lose sight of them. And Jean-Pierre Dupuis wants to improve all this, considering the devastating potential of each hazard, understand each dynamism in situ. And by exchanging on all these topics before the symposium, Jean-Pierre Dupuis also shared with me this intellectual debt he had towards this great thinker, Ivan Illich. And for more than 10 years, he was his personal secretary. He told me that in 2022, they would hold the 20th anniversary of his death and the 50th anniversary of a very important book, Énergie et Équité, that would publicize this concept of counterproductivity based on the study of all the disturbances by thinking about the overconsumption of our society. So we agreed on the fact that his contribution could be a tribute to Ivan Illich. I have a new program, and that's the one you have in your handouts, I think. And unfortunately, there's an intensification of these climate change, and the major changes and disasters shows us the front line of this common horizon. However, each disaster opens in itself a piece of the new world that we need to rebuild in a preventive way, because it is before the disasters that architects and urbanists are working on all these topics. We have to take into account the scale of these threats, which are unique and impacting, and we have to imagine, we have to do things, and this has to be rooted in a different rationale than what was used in the past. And this is how Ivan Illich's contribution, his freedom to think about reality in a different way, and the narration that it opens to. And Jean-Pierre Dupuis thought it interesting at the introduction of the symposium that it would be a good resource to meet the unexpectedness of the future situations that we would encounter. So I'd like to give the floor to Jean-Pierre Dupuis now.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. At this very moment, when I'm talking to you, this is this Sunday, the 10th of October in the evening. I'm on the campus of Stanford University in California. I cannot see you for two reasons, because of space and time. First of all, you haven't met yet. You'll be meeting in 4 to 5 days from now. And secondly, in space, we are very far from each other. And for me, you are all anonymous people Of course, that is not how I conceive that men can talk with each other, and I will try my best to overcome this obstacle. And with the agreement of my host, Xavier Bonneau, whom I'd like to warmly thank for his invitation, and thanks to his impulsion, I have decided to talk about Ivan Illich, who is a thinker and an activist. He became the Monsignore of the Catholic Church, and at the end of the 60s, especially in the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, launched in the world a series of radical criticisms that had great success. Young people who are listening to me, who are hearing me, might not have heard about him, although they currently use words and expressions that he forged himself, to which he's given a new meaning. For example, friendliness, counterproductivity. The end of the 30 Glorious, the oil failure, the arrival of socialism in France, this relegated the radical style of his criticism. Almost 20 years after his death, he is back now, particularly among young people, especially among the young Americans. Now, I don't want you to keep seeing my face, and I myself don't want to see my own face, which is very embarrassing. And so therefore, I'm going to show you a few slides that are more interesting. And so therefore, I would like to share my screen with you. I hope that I will manage to do so. And there you go. Here's my screen. I hope you can see the title of my presentation, which is The Destruction of the Human Space-Time, a tribute to Ivan Illich for the 20th anniversary almost of his demise. So here are a few pictures of Ivan Illich at several times of his life, when he was very young, slightly older, little older still, and the fourth picture, which is very interesting in several respects. You can see him on the right, and you see from his cheek, you see a growth, and he was affected by a cancer of his salivary gland called parotid, and that is what killed him in 2002, on the 2nd of December 2002. Besides him, a Mexican friend of his, and on the left, a very interesting figure who is Jerry Brown, who was the governor of California 4 times. Last time, it was until 2019, just before the pandemic, therefore. And you can see him here, Jerry Brown, who is the former governor of California. Sorry, yes, I must explain to you that with the agreement of Xavier Bonneau, since there are English speakers amongst you, I suppose you all speak English, but I'll translate everything, and I will show you most of my slides in French and in English. So, disciple of Ivan Illich, Jerry Brown, therefore, and he's worked on 2 very important topics for the future of humanity: climate change and the possibility of a nuclear war. And I'm working in collaboration with him, and it is thanks to Ivan Illich that we met in the south of Mexico, where Illich is established. This is what we would see at the time in the 70s. This is the center created by Illich, the SIDOC. This is the sacred volcano Popocatépetl, That is the man who smokes in Aztec language, the wattle. And there's the other sacred volcano that you cannot see here on this picture, which is the Litsa sea wattle, which is the woman lying down. And this picture would be impossible to see because we are at 60 kilometers from the city of Mexico, and Mexico City is one of the most polluted cities in the world, and there's a fog covering this entire region, and so therefore we have very bad visibility, unfortunately. So here are some very important books written by Ivan Illich. They have all been published in French. I've translated the titles. Deschooling Society, Tools for Conviviality, Energy and Equity, Medical Nemesis, Limits to Medicine, Toward a History of Needs, Shadow Work, Gender. I worked with him for 10 years in the 70s, and I worked with him in France and in Mexico. And I developed with him, because his French was absolutely remarkable, the French versions of Energy and Equity and Medical Nemesis. So those are the French titles that I'm quoting. So I'm going to begin with a concept which is very important for him, which is the diversion of production, rationale. And that's the originality of Ivan Illich's criticism that he would oppose to the industrial mode of production. What he's describing are not the production ratios according to the Marxist characterization of production, nor a technical relationship to nature. And at the foundation, you find this rationale, the diversion of this foundation. And it is through this concept that we could highlight the elective affinities that link capitalism to the philosophical system of this mathematician and philosopher of the 17th century, who was German and who often wrote in French, who is Leibniz. And so this is his book, Theodicy, in 1710. And theodicy is God's judgment. It's not God's judgment according to which God judges, but God is judge. He's accused of being the origin of the creation of evil. And here we are accusing God, and that is theodicy. So for Leibniz, the thesis according to which the human being is characterized by his ability to make diversions to reach his ends, this is essential. Human beings can make diversions to go faster. He can stop consuming and investing to increase his overall future consumption. He can refuse a favorable opportunity to wait for a better opportunity still, etc. For the ecologists, that is, those who are specialized in animal behavior, this ability determines intelligence. And here, for example, you can see a hen who can see a bowl of corn on the other side of the fence, separating the hen from the bowl, and the hen cannot go around the fence except perchance to reach the food that he wanted to or she wanted to eat. If you replace the hen by a chimpanzee, well, the food is a banana, and the chimpanzee knows how to go around the fence. So that is what determines intelligence for the etologists, those who study animal behavior, therefore. But it applies to ourselves. We can go around things to reach our ends. And this ability is closely related to what the German sociologist Max Weber called the instrumental rationality, that is, using our means for an end. And this adjustment goes through these detours. And all this complies with this thesis because we can act rationally, that is, we can maximize a certain grandeur. But this principle of optimization must be understood as a global maximization, optimization, and not just a local one. Let's suppose that in a mountainous region, you are at the top left, and you want to go as high as possible. And you see another summit, the one in the center, which is much higher. I suppose that you're not stuck to the ground, and you do not have a cable car or a helicopter, and you don't have any other means to go higher, but first you have to go down, therefore. That is the whole point, the diversion of production. You have to go down first so that you can then go up to the highest summit. If you refuse to do so, you will land up with what we call the first step fallacy. And if you want to go to the moon and you are at the top of a tree, well, the best thing to do, although the tree is closer to the moon than the ground, the best thing for you to do is to get off the tree so that you can reach the moon afterwards. So that is the production detour, and that is the fallacy of the first step fallacy. Leibniz saw in man something that was the image of what he would see in God, and that is precisely having recourse to this detour for the Creator so as to realize the best of all the possible worlds. God had to allow a certain dose of evil, otherwise the actual world would have been far worse. So this evil that exists in the world, and we cannot deny its existence, well, it is at the service of overall good. It is a sacrifice that allows us to optimize overall good. And so this detour rationale, this is a key element in modernity, and this is key to economic rationality. However, Illich says that it can be the main obstacle to implement instrumental rationality. So we are ready to put in the same bag instrumental rationality and detour rationale. Industrial society highlights that this detour rationale can be counterproductive at the highest point because, and this is the main point, the one who wants to overcome an obstacle and goes back to better jump, to be able to run and then jump, that is the whole rationale of this detour. Well, the one who goes too far in this rationale might run the risk of losing sight of his objective and might consider his regression as progress, or understand the means as the end. So therefore, we have to understand that these ins and outs of this instrumental rationality, Illich shows us the stupidness of motorization. If you want to go somewhere, well, if that is your objective, well, it would be wrong of you to use industrial modes of transportation. Now, to progress, I will go through the Illichian analysis of medicine counterproductivity, because that is the matrix of all the rest. And the analysis of transportation will be the same as what Illich will say about medicine. former prelate, as I said, and very critical about the church, from which he had been thrown out in a dishonorable way. Illich says that the church has a radical monopoly on salute, and medicine did the same thing in the field of health. In one case, as in the other, the result is the greater the institution, the more it becomes an obstacle for the end it is supposed to serve. That is counterproductivity. It is not a lower yield. It is that the institution produces the opposite of what it was created for. And medicine destroys health, as you're going to see, according to Illich, of course. And you're going to see that transportation, but you probably know it immobilizes. And just during one of his stays in Abaca in the winter of 95, that I wrote the French version of his book, Medical Nemesis. Nemesis is the Greek goddess of vengeance. Now, what I provided in the discussion is that I insisted on two forms of counterproductivity, one that we called social and the other that we called structural or symbolical. Since these two counterproductivities are pulling in two opposite directions, of course, they scramble the message. And the first counterproductivity, the social counterproductivity, Illich presents himself as a progressist activist, and according to the second one, the structural, the symbolical, as a thinker, reactionary thinker. But there was only one Illich, and one must understand that. At the time, a French friend, Serge Carcenti, who died far too early, and myself, we published a book that had obtained a certain amount of success, a scandalous book called Pharmaceutical Invasion, L'invasion pharmaceutique, where we introduced a notion which is the medicalization of life and a formula: medicine has become the alibi of a pathogen society. I'm going to explain all this. And by that we meant that a lot of evils of modern society, like the grandeur of the production, the density of urban areas, the fact that everything is burst out, the desecration of families, the anguish because of fierce competition between individuals. These are pathologies that can be presented to the medical corps and that can receive therapy. There are medication for that. And these questions that are related to the political sphere are therefore naturalized. Medicine is the accomplice of status quo. That would be its social counterproductivity. So that's in the book, and Illich also repeated this analysis, and he regretted this some 15 years later. His technique to convince was to shock. The paradox was his soul of predilection. And when his ideas would enter common consciousness, when they were successful, and that was the case, and especially when they were taken over by professionals who were the target of his criticism, well, this criticism would lose any importance in his eyes. And this is what happened throughout the years with part of the doctors who saw that what they were asked for was not related to what they learned in school. According to Illich's lesson, as they would understand it, it seemed urgent for them to demedicalize society and to give patients back their power by encouraging their autonomy and by making sure that they would manage their health themselves. Illich, that in a speech that he pronounced on the 4th of September 1917 in Hanover, Germany, his mother tongue was German, under the title significatif, because he perfectly mastered French and French culture. The title Cyrano-esque, I'd like to quote, "Health would be my personal responsibility? ? No, thank you." And he reuse what he wrote in Medical Nemesis under the category of symbolical counterproductivity of medicine. Structural health or symbolical health for man is his ability to aware in a conscious way and in an autonomous way, not the risks of the environment, but a series of intimate threats that any man knows or will know, and that will lead to pain, illness, and death. This ability, the man of traditional society has always drawn this from his culture, and this gave birth to his condition as a mortal person. The sacred is fundamental. The modern world, which was reborn from the ruins of this symbolical world, has taken into account the irrational and the arbitrary. In his enterprise to demystify all this, he didn't understand that there are limits to human condition, while he tried to give them meaning. By replacing the sacred by reason and science, he's lost the sense of limitations, and that is the whole meaning. Medical expansion goes with the myth according to which getting rid of pain, disability, and pushing away death, this is realizable and desirable thanks to the medical system. But we can give meaning to all this only if we can draw out, after a certain level, the medicine and its myths are destroying structural health. And today, it's the famous transhumanists, one of the most famous ones, Sidke, who lives close to where I'm talking to you from in this extraordinary book, The Fantastic Voyage. Here, it is a question of living long enough so that we can live forever, according to Ray Kurzweil. So, in this book, 3/4 of the book talks about daily care, eat well, take good rest, exercise, etc., so that you can live long enough so that you might be capable of living forever. But the main sentence is this one. I view disease and death at any age as a calamity, as problems to be overcome. Problems to be overcome. Probably the first time. Of course, this ideal of immortality has always existed in this world, but that we consider death as a problem that must be solved, that is something new. And Illich answered, we must have a sarcastic readiness for all surprises, including the ultimate surprise of death. And now I will go on to our main topic. The criticism of medicine will really be useful here, and I'd like to talk about counterproductivity, the counterproductivity of the transportation system. We're going to have the same tension between two types of counterproductivities, the social one and the symbolical one. The perversion of the detour perversion is more apparent here because the detour finds its literal origin in the movement we have in space and time. The counterproductivity of transportation follows the same reasoning as the medical criticism. Industrial transportation, this is a pathogen alibi. Pathogen because we are in a society that destroys spaces and the lifetimes. But transportation is there to serve as a remedy to the evil that they contribute to create. That is counterproductivity. If this alibi functions, that means that transportation will substitute this movement from working time, and that's what I'm going to try to explain to you now. So here you go. Sorry, just before I do this, I'd like to make a digression, which is important. This is a parable that was used in certain law schools in the United States more particularly, it is a thinking process. An evil genie paid visit to the president of a certain country and made the following proposal. I know that your economy is a bit sluggish, and I would like to help you strengthen it. I can place at your disposal a fabulous technology and invention that will double your gross domestic product and increase the number of jobs in the same proportion. But there is a price to be paid. Each year, I will ask you for the lives of 20,000 people of your country, and a high proportion of them will be young men and women. And the president recoiled in horror and dismissed his visitor at once. So you see, it's a kind of minotaur, and there's a price to be paid to improve the economy.
Well, what was the invention then that the genie proposed that was refused? This one. The president had just rejected the invention of the automobile. Well, that's because we never present things this way. Road accidents are not to be aggregated. Yes, they are. If you look at statistics, that's true, but not ethically, not in morals. We never present things this way. It's a statistical fatality, I'd say. Whereas here, this is cost and benefits. Here's another remark. This drawing here, the vicious circle of needs. Again, the two friends, they go to work on one of their cars, and they're side by side, and there's the one that says, I hate driving, but I need a car to go to work. And then when they're at work, I hate my job, but I've got to pay my car in installments. So that's the foundation of counterproductivity, social counterproductivity of transportation. Now let's think about something else. This is something very famous, the hare and the tortoise. Now let's imagine that the Americans, for instance, well, it could be the French, are deprived of their cars, and no cars are made any longer. So in this scenario, they would need to work less to afford this car. And as far as global economy is concerned, then no cars would be made any longer. So all the working time would disappear, would vanish altogether. And all transportation systems and all the commuting for these Americans to go from home to the office or to do the shopping, transportation to go on holidays, well, let's assume that all of these movements disappear. Then we could calculate easily that the time spent at work plus leisure time, well, this time would be shrinking. This is the hare and the tortoise. Well, if you look at the hare, rather than sleeping to wake up too late, the hare is working a lot at the office, in the factory, etc. So the hare can run faster. Okay, that's the production detour, but it's not moving, but it's working so that it could have the means to move faster. But at the end of the day, it's the tortoise that wins the race. And Illich was saying that, well, ironically, as usual, he would say, now, this scenario would be seen or considered as absurd. Is it less comical than the current scenario, whereby we spend a lot of time working so that we can have something to go and work? This is the question. And the question is that of the invisibility of evil. Where does this come from? Well, for Illich, the objective was not to consider the apology of the bicycle. This was too simplistic, an interpretation of this. And there are still papers on that nowadays that appear, that are written up. And we've considered that he was all in favor of the bicycle. Well, maybe partly, but that's not the point. The question is, why don't we see how absurd the current scenario is when, in this experiment here, we see immediately that the situation is absurd? Well, because we've replaced the commuting, the displacement, by working time. In the current scenario, we work in order to produce fast vehicles, well, so-called fast, thanks to which will save time. But if you do the maths, you will see that you will be wasting time, not gaining time. Well, the two scenarios are absurd, I know, but why could we say that reality or the current scenario doesn't seem to be absurd to us? Well, it's because working time and commuting time, well, even though, of course, the economists would take this very seriously, they don't think in terms of time. The economists think in terms of cost. Rather than turning costs in time, which is what I've just done, they would turn time in cost. That is, they add to the maintenance costs for your cars, the time spent by people to commute, to travel, multiplied by what they consider is the value of time. And if you divide this by the value of time, you will get the same result. But this time in terms of time, which is what I've just done. But can we really do this? No, we can't, for the following reason, is that there's a difference between work and transportation. Even though, of course, the two words, well, this is, in some languages, even though the same words could be used for both. If we go from Latin to French to English, the origin is tripalium. That is, three piles, to torture people, as you can see on the photo there. It's to torture people, the tripalium. So three spikes, three piles, that is grown into the word in French, travail. And in English, the word travail is a word that we use when women give birth. And then there's ergonomy, labor in English, and Werk in German. But the same word, tripalium, led to travel as well. Travel really sounds like the French travail, so the origin is the same. But as we know, the travail, work, has its positive sides that travel doesn't have. For instance, access to being with others in a social environment. And maybe the final objective for our societies is to produce labor, that is a production detour. Labor is a detour of production in this case. Well, this perhaps doesn't highlight the evil in industrial transportation or travel. I could even say that the objective of the industrial society is to produce production detours, that is, labor. Now then, let us come to symbolic or structural counterproductivity, which is probably the most important notion. The traditional lived space is connex. That is, if you think in terms of topology, a connex space, as you probably know, is a space which is such that two given points in this space can always be connected with a continuous line that doesn't go out of this territory. Yet, the industrial society is the first one to have broken this link. Personal spaces are broken down into bits and pieces that are not connected and far away from each other, which is what you can see on the drawing. There's where you work, where you are at home, there's stores, leisure, and something else which is not shown here on the drawing, which is the elsewhere notion, the notion of elsewhere, that is escapism, evasion, leisure, holidays. In between these different domains, there are links. The greenish types of links here, they make sense here. There are deserts of meaning. They're aesthetic and symbolic that we want to cross as efficiently as possible. And to do this, we use transportation system. Think about highways, motorways, the space of motorway. We're in a metal bubble, which sometimes becomes your own coffin, and the space where your Boeing or Airbus is. And it's the original choice that consists in accepting the fact that part of your space-time starting with the poorest one, is given up because we think that transportation is more efficient. And that's the foundation of structural counterproductivity. This is the original sin, to some extent. The original choice that says that part of your vital space-time will be given up because you assume that transportation is more efficient. Well, this choice has led to no revolt from the citizens. This is what we call the invisibility of evil, according to Illich. It's because transportation is the ritual of a myth that says that you go back to a possible neighbor thanks to others. To have a global village, you have to cancel these spaces empty of meaning, represented here by the green links. Well, these dead spaces which should be conquered once and for all. So we accept these spaces that are empty of meaning because with this sacrifice, well, these spaces and these times will be vanishing, will be cancelled off. And this is what I meant by the production detour. And the advertisers say that the transportation god will meet your needs. Unfortunately, I couldn't find that in my papers, but I remember a Swiss airplane company and their ads. They had ads in some papers in Europe. The drawing was showing an old city, rich with culture and variety, with monuments, squares, rivers, and roads and streets. But if you looked into the drawing more carefully, you would understand this was a monster. What we had there aggregated the best districts in the nicest cities in Europe, and the Red Square was not far from the Concorde Square, and there was only a river in between. And the subtitle was that, thanks to our airline company, Europe has shrunk very much. It's amazing. I'm sorry I couldn't find the drawing. Now, to understand the surprising alienation of the industrial person and to see that he accepts what is intolerable, we have to understand the myth of going back to original neighbors and the dead space times, far from disappearing thanks to more efficient transportation systems, will, on the contrary, gain more available space-time. According to the calculation at the time, 1/3 of your life when you're awake is half the urban space. Los Angeles, Sao Paulo, and Illich in his book showed that the different transportation modes that exist have their own abilities to reduce the cognitive dissonance between myth and reality. There's at one end you have walking and bicycles, which is open to the symbolic richness of the surrounding environment, which is pleasant only if such an environment exists. At the other end, there's private cars that seem the best instrument to use far before common transportation systems in a society that destroys space and time. And it gives an image of itself that's contrary to reality. The image is made of mobility, autonomy, and independence, but reality is dependence on transportation systems and people's behaviors on the roads. Well, what I'm saying now is something very easy to understand, and this is not connected to the technical aspects of transportation systems for these cars, whether they use gas, electricity, or fuel, or gasoline, rather. And the car drivers describe their machines as a bubble in which they're isolated from the hostile environment. It's an extension of their homes, or sometimes an umbilical cord that connects them potentially and symbolically to the place where they would like to be, and which are never the places where they truly are. So the counterproductive circle, which is symbolic or structural, would therefore close up, and they would live in the space-time of industrial society. It is necessary to have access to transportation tools, but the existence of such tools cancel what would model space and time. These forces were described quite rigorously. I'm sure that some of you, or many of you, have done that or have been thinking about this, whether it be the logic of property or property speculation, the determinants of size and location of economic and social activities, etc. What we know less generally is the doping effect of speed on the disintegration processes and totalism of space. These analyses are approximately 50 years old, and alas, I think their substance makes even more sense today than at the time when they appeared, were discussed and written down. That is, in the 1970s, there was the first oil shock that should have shaken global capitalism. People were hardly talking about climate change at the time, but those who knew didn't need to think about a global disaster to understand that there was an invisible disaster that was very important that was starting, the destruction of human space time. That is the framework of our lives. Illich remains one of these very few pioneers. Well, voila, I'm over, I'm done, and I'm back with you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, dear participants. I hope that you're going to enjoy these 2 days. Take great care of yourselves, but not too much, if you've listened carefully to the lessons given to us by Illich. Goodbye.